Hello, welcome. I am Jill Savitt, the CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our programming for Black History Month. We're delighted you're joining us today. So today we're going to do a deep talk about Black history. In particular, we're going to explore the importance of telling the truth of history, how engaging with historical truths, especially around race and civil rights, can help us create a future that is more just, humane, and equitable. So as you all can imagine, I approach this topic as the director of a history museum. And every week, visitors who go through our exhibitions will say to me, to our staff, I had no idea. I didn't know. And that's about civil rights history, which is pretty well covered in schools. Now, some of this might be because we don't remember the history we learned in school, but there's a larger issue at play. History, as it's taught in schools or remembered when we're adults, often lacks honesty because parts of our history have been concealed or revised or even erased. We see that in the national debate playing out across our country right now about how history is taught in schools. So 2 years ago, the center started a project to tell a fuller history about Atlanta, to help people explore what has been neglected by schools and forgotten in public memory. We call this project Truth and Transformation. With it, we will share and memorialize 2 episodes that have been really omitted from the telling of our city's history: the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre, and the practice of convict labor and convict leasing as it happened at Bellwood Quarry, which is in our new West Side Reservoir Park, as well as at the site of the former Chattahoochee Brick Company. Today's program will address the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre. And on the evening of February 23rd, we'll do a program about convict leasing on the west side of Atlanta. So to talk about the events of 1906, we have 3 panelists. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history itself and what we all can do to ensure that we know the truth of history. So I am delighted to introduce our panelists, who are also partners of ours. Marlon Burnley is the Associate Artistic Director at Out of Hand Theater. He is also an actor and director. Ann Hill Bond is an independent researcher and journalist and a leader of the Fulton County Remembrance Coalition. And Hank Klibanoff is the director of the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project at Emory, and he is also the host and creator of the Buried Truths podcast on WABE. Before we jump in, just want to let you all know that the comments of our panelists are their own and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. So I'm going to start with Hank to set a context for all of us. There might be people here who have maybe just for the first time are hearing about the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre. So can you give us a sense of what that event was, so we're all starting from about the same page?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this today and to be with Ann and Marlon and you. 1906 Atlanta was a time of great change. It was a time when the streets were filled with people. You've gotten past Reconstruction, you've gotten past redemption in the South, and there is increased employment, increased wealth, increased mobility by everyone. There is Black wealth that's growing, both at the very top and throughout and up and down. More and more Black people are making more and more money. There is they would never call it liberation, but there is a liberation of women. There are women in the workforce. There are women out walking to work. There are women walking home at night after work. And there's on the trains, and there's just a greater mingling of Black and white. That is happening in a nervous sort of way in 1906 when we are in the heat of a statewide elections here in Georgia. And there's a race for governor. I mean, what could go wrong with a heated economy, heated race relations, overheated maybe, and political elections. The one-time liberal owner and editor of the Atlanta Journal, Hoke Smith, is running for governor. He favors, he's no longer liberal. He's really turned quite conservative. He favors suppressing the Black vote. He's carved out a white supremacist message. His main opponent for the governor's office, and there were several, but his main opponent was Clark Howell, who'd worked as managing editor for the rival Atlanta Constitution until he purchased enough stock to own the paper. He was more moderate in 1906 than Hoke Smith. He wanted to eliminate the convict leasing system you were referring to, Jill. But you would never know that he was more moderate to look at the Constitution. The Constitution and the Journal were just full of rage about the new freedoms that Blacks seemed to be exhibiting on the streets, in bars, being out, spending money. And there was a real white supremacist invective in the newspapers. They became screed sheets. They did not always, well, they often did not hew to the truth. And they seized on the one thing that we know historically really riled up white people, particularly white men, and that is Black men allegedly assaulting white women. Now, there were 4 so-called rapes in this very short period of time leading up to the Atlanta Race Massacre. And I'll just say this for starters, and then we'll move on here. At least 2 of those, the stories themselves said that doctors examined the women and there was no evidence that they had been violated, okay? And yet, even though the newspaper reported that, a couple of times they continued to refer to these as rapes, okay? So they were pretty much out of control and had lost their, ethical bearings on this thing. And it just whipped people into a frenzy as we headed into this political election on September. Over this 3.5-day period, whites came in by the thousands with sticks, with guns, with knives, and entered places of business in downtown Atlanta, massacred Blacks on the streets. It was a gruesome bloodletting. And before it was all over, at least 26 people were killed. Black people were killed, and 15 of them have been identified. 11 are listed as unknown, and it's been something that we can certainly understand if people in this community have still not gotten over. The last thing I'll say is that in the aftermath of this, the business community, the elite in Atlanta, and that's Black and white, really wanted to try to come together to see, can we save our city? And they much too quickly decided that they had by merely coming together. We've done the right thing. We've saved the city. They created a board. They actually paid reparations, okay? A lot of Black Atlanta families received reparations that ranged. It was $40 to $200 back then, and I think that ran up to as high as, I have the calculations here, that ran between $1,500 and $12,500 in today's dollars. So there were reparations. But it's led to people being critical that the city of Atlanta was much too quick to say, we've come together, we've worked this out, without really dealing with the core problems of white supremacy and racism in the city. Yeah,
thank you, Hank. Marlon and Ann, I want to give you a chance. You've spent a lot of time with this history, with the people involved, especially the victims and survivors of this massacre. Starting with you, Ann, is there any other pieces of this history that you think people should know as we begin to talk about the events of 1906?
Absolutely. First, thank you for inviting me to this platform. So yeah, I think that a lot of what Hank said is very important. The other part that constantly gets left out is the resilience that African Americans shown in this time in Brownsville, which is in South Atlanta. So if you're in Atlanta, you know Atlanta, right? That would be over where Carver High School is, because Atlanta has a very big high school culture. So it would be over where Carver High School is. That used to be Brownsville. That was an area of town where African Americans were thriving. It was the epicenter of Black intellect, thought leaders, and culture. So given the time, 1906, right after slavery, right after Reconstruction and so forth and so on, you have this neighborhood that is thriving, that people, even after the riots, talks about how beautiful it is and how the houses are built and how there is schools and there is colleges, and then there is no, saloons or bars or anything. There's churches. There's this beautiful community with African Americans living and thriving. So it is always left out of the conversation, but it is an important part of the conversation given the year. And so given the year, given the time, to see African Americans thriving at such a level right after, enslavement, right after Reconstruction and so forth, had to be a little disheartening to those that wanted to see the oppression, right? And so that is often left out. And then I think what's important, there's a African proverb that says, if you want to plan for 3 generations forward, you must look 3 generations backwards. So when we often talk about 1906 race massacre, one, I'm happy that we're using the correct language, right? We're no longer calling it a riot, that we are stating the truth of it being a massacre. We often never talk about the African Americans that were seated at the table, the Alfonso Herndon and Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and Reverend Proctor and Benjamin Davis and, Garland Penn, all of these people that played a part in the Atlanta we know today, shaping and molding the fabric of the Atlanta, but in a very interesting way, working with the whites of that time. And I think another part that is often not spoken about in this history is the classism that took place in Atlanta, that took place within the African American community, within the white community at that particular time. And then the other part that I feel is definitely left out is, while Hank pointed out reparations were paid, there was a very defined way of telling the truth that was done by the Committee of 10, which was a committee of 10 white men that were very clear of how we're going to tell this truth moving forward in Atlanta. That is often not talked about, right? And to make matters even worse, one of the 10 his name is slipping me right now, came out even after, the massacre was said to be a horrible and a horrific thing, came out and said in written form, this can be, pulled up in newspapers, that, this massacre will now keep African Americans in their place in Atlanta for 5 years. And with that, to show the strong arm that was still there, while we talk about the kumbaya of Black and whites in Atlanta, to show the strong arm that was still there, we see that they were very serious, because when Jay Barber, who was a writer, editor at the Negro Voice at the time, wrote his accounts of the massacre, he was told very clearly, you went against what we decided of how we're going to tell the story. And you have 2 options. You can join the chain gang or you can be exiled. Within 24 hours, Mr. Barber had left and went to Chicago, shut his paper down, right? And then started a new paper in Chicago called The Voice. And so all of these things, while they're very little, to some people, it is an important part of the narrative because it tells the story from the African-American perspective, which is often not told. And then the part that we did arm ourselves, right? We did say, well, listen, if we can dress a certain way, we can look a certain way, we can walk a certain way, we can do all of this to assimilate into white culture, and you're still going to kill us. So, pretty much let's go. And so that happened. And when that happened, in a mixture of African Americans arming themselves, and then with the $200,000 loss in that time that Atlanta was facing, between those two things is really what ended the massacre. Besides that, people were going home, taking a shower, going to bed, waking up and killing people. So those are the truths that I wish people would speak more of.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. It's just to put a little context overall for everybody. These kinds of lynchings, these kinds of massacres were a tactic of racial terror. And this is not an isolated incident. In Georgia, in the period after Reconstruction, for several decades, there are 5,000 lynchings. Mm-hmm. And this event was a massacre where 25 people were murdered. But there's another massacre that happened in Palmetto, Georgia, also in Fulton County. So just to make clear, this is not an isolated incident. And as Anne was saying, and as Hank said, this was an attempt to stop Black progress. So it was a strategy. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind, not an isolated incident, part of a wider strategy of terror that is a deliberate tactic with this excuse that gets pulled out from time to time about this assault on white women. Marlon, you've spent a lot of time with this history as well. Can you add to this anything that stands out in particular for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks Anne and Hank for your insight and your thoughts. So to avoid running the risk of repeating, I'll just hit on a couple things. So for one, Jill, you mentioned earlier about how people come through your space and say, wow, I never knew. And I was one of those people before I started work on this project at Out of Hand. I'm from Indiana, so us in Indiana, we just know Indiana. It was all very insightful, but the things that stuck out to me the most was how this was propagated by politicians, and law enforcement did not help in any way. And the biggest thing, I love that Anne hit on resilience. That's my biggest thing, is like the resiliency of the Black community that always shines through. When I was going through my research, this poem that kind of lives with me kind of popped up, and it's by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and it's called "We Wear the Mask." And there's this line that goes, "We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties." And so to me, that's so beautiful, and that's like the through line of this massacre. Yes, it was a lot of bad happened, and lives were lost, but also we tend to forget that they rose above, and they found strength in each other and within themselves throughout this. And so for me, as the playwright researching this, it was important to think of that and how I can bring that to today, and how we still see that today, especially within the last few years, with everything being able to be shown on social media, and us being able to connect in that way and go in the streets and shout the names of people, of lives lost. It's a really beautiful thing. So for me, the resiliency is key in this.
And our museum makes a deliberate point of connecting history to the present. And there's this saying among historians that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Mm-hmm. So as you just said, politicians using dog whistling and racial division to try and get people to their side, and police operating at the behest of, racists, segregationists, we see how events in the past are very reminiscent of things that we can relate to in our culture today. So I want to talk, we've covered a little bit of the history, and we will get we'll get Q&A later so people can ask particular questions if they have them. But all three of you represent organizations that are working about making this history relevant today in various ways. And so I'm going to start with you, Hank, again, about Emory, the Georgia Cold Cases Project. And Emory is part of our Truth and Transformation Initiative. Can you talk a little bit about what you're working on, what you and your researchers are working on?
Sorry. I will say, as a teacher who looks to bring history alive, who doesn't want history to disappear, doesn't want historical figures to become ciphers, that, and this is not a political statement, but I didn't, it was not very difficult to say to students, if you have no concept of what it's like to suddenly have 5,000 angry and armed people, mostly men, mostly white men, running through the streets, breaking into offices, taking up arms against law enforcement, then just go back and look at the footage of January 6th again. Again, I'm not giving you a political statement, I'm giving you a visual presence in our own time. And so the number in Atlanta who ran through downtown and then made it, as Ann was saying, all the way over to Southside to Brownsville, was anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000. And so for my students, trying to bring it alive, particularly not just even 1906, but the cold cases that I do from the 1940s and 50s and 60s, often is going there, being there, going to the cemeteries, going to meet the families of the survivors of the families, digging up a lot of the historical records, whether it's through the using the Federal Freedom of Information Act, or looking at through Ancestry and trying to piece things together. And that's what I'm doing now with a group of researchers, students and former students, mostly from Emory and Spelman, who are examining the lives of the 26 victims of the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre, trying to learn more about who they were, what they did, trying to animate their lives, trying to find descendants. It's an ongoing process. We spend a lot of time training the students. If anybody listening is a professional genealogist and wants to get involved, I've got a place for you, because I've begun to realize that this has to be a professional pursuit, not just a classroom effort.
Yeah, and Hank, you've said to me in the past that one of the challenges is that record keeping of the Black community from that period of 1906 makes it particularly more difficult. It
is more difficult. They say what the victors always write the history, but they also will sometimes destroy the history of the defeated. And it's what the Nazis did to the history of my family, and what is now Belarus, where records are just impossible to find or very difficult. It's what white people did to the record keeping of Black people. I recently had an opportunity to say, the government has created this new board that will, I'll keep this piece short, but a new board named by President Biden to examine all of the records being held by the government about racial murders that took place in a more modern time, 1940 to 1970, I believe it is. And I was nominated for that. And I was trying to explain to the Homeland Security Committee, not that they need me to explain, but I do think it's worth reminding that when you kill, this is not about a killing of a single person. We got names on the monument at Brian Stevenson's memorial over in Montgomery. It's not just about killing an individual. When you kill a father or a mother or a grandfather, sometimes you're wiping out all known history about that particular family. And when you burn people's homes, you burn their scrapbooks, you burn their photographs, you burn recorded history. And that's just something we deal with every day, that the record doesn't exist. And that's tragic. As I say that as a historian, but also as someone who treasures his own, collection of family things, and more than anything other than his wife and children. So
Yes.
I think this is hugely important that we get as many people involved in preserving that history so we can talk about it honestly.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. So Anne, building on that, so Hank is doing a lot of research into the 25 or 26, it's a number that's still in doubt, that were murdered over those 4 days in September 1906. You're involved in a unbelievably interesting and cool project about memorialization and the importance of that. Can you talk about Fulton County Remembrance Coalition and the work that you all are doing?
Absolutely. So Fulton County Remembrance Coalition was started by a group of graduate students from UGA. I'm sorry, not UGA. Georgia State. Georgia State. You can tell I have some UGA thoughts in my mind.
Yeah.
From Georgia State. And they took on this project with from the Legacy Museum in Alabama with Brian Stevenson. And it's a project where you can go, well, first of all, everyone should go to not only the National Human and Civil Rights Museum, but we should also be going to Alabama to visit the Legacy Museum, which talks about, racial terror, mass incarceration, and it just does a beautiful job of exploring our history in totality. And so in that space, the project was birthed. And so the project is where we will go in Georgia. We had the most we had the most lynchings. And after that, and within that, Fulton County had the most in the county. So we have a total of 36 lynchings here in Fulton County. And so what Fulton County Remembrance Coalition has done is go around first and honor those sites by collecting soil. And they live in two places, the soil jars. They live at Legacy Museum and then at Auburn Research downtown here in Atlanta. And so in collecting the soil, we honor the space by acknowledging the people, right? Because it's easy for us to talk about the 1906 race massacre and call them victims. But before they were victims, they were people. They were people that lives mattered, that smiles lit up a room, that somebody was happy to see, that came from a mother and a father, right? And so these people need to be remembered as for their essence, not just as victims of racial terror. So that's what Fulton County Remembrance Coalition strives to do every single day. So we have collected all 36 all 36 victims, which is 14 or 15 rather, 14 named Atlanta Race Massacre victims, and then 11 unknown. But we also know through research from EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, that there was hundreds that just are unnamed. We just don't know because as Hank pointed out, I read accounts up until last night. It was 10,000 people here in Atlanta, 10,000 white men here in Atlanta going crazy on Black people, right? But we can average it out to about 8,000. So it's hard to say 8,000 people were in the streets killing African Americans and say only 25 died. So these are just what we know. This is what just the research is showing us currently today, that there was 25, 14 with names, 11 unknown. But as a community, as a people, as a collective that has been through this time and time again, we know that there's hundreds that we probably won't ever get to. So Fulton County Remembrance Coalition, when we go to these spaces to collect the soil, we also go in remembrance of the essence of our ancestors. So that's the project that we're working on. And following that project, we will put up memorial plaques giving the historical narratives for each victim, each person that was at each lynching site, not just 1906, but also the other lynching victims. But in regards to 1906, we're putting up 2 plaques, one in Brownsville and one in downtown Atlanta, to show the connectivity of the great disturbance that was caused on those 3-4 days. So that's where we are currently at. We're currently at the marker stage. We hope to have our markers go up. Well, we will have our markers go up in September. And then as a part of that, last year, we had the city to recognize it as a massacre, which was a big deal, and stop calling it a riot. It is a massacre. We had so many lives lost. So that was an initiative that we pride ourselves on as well. And then this year, we're looking for the county and the state to acknowledge it as a massacre as well. So that's what we're currently working on. And you guys can participate, FYI.
If you wouldn't mind, Anne, putting full FCRC's website in the chat, because FCRC does soil collections, they have a quilt project, all kinds of ways for the community to get involved, besides going to Auburn Avenue Research Library to see the amazing exhibition of the soil that's been collected from the sites of these lynchings. Marlon, I want to move it over to you and to talk about equitable dinners, because that is an immediate way that people who are watching can become engaged in this. And before I turn it over to you, I just want to say that, you know, the centennial last year of the Tulsa Race Massacre happened, and there were, you know, people watched the Watchmen and learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and a lot of people in our country never heard of it. Mm-hmm. Again, I didn't know, you know, how could I not know about this? And people in Atlanta do not know that there was a similar event here. And it's very important to spread the word in all kinds of ways. So just so everyone knows, the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre did not make it into Georgia history books until, drum roll, 2007. More than 100 years after the event. It's not required to be taught in school. So it's very much present that this event is not well known, not taught in school, not in public memory. And so, Marlon, you were involved in a huge way that we're going to try and address this, if you could talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit about Equitable Dinners, the program itself. It was born out of the Decatur dinners. Mothers saw some issues that she was not okay with in her school district, and she wanted a way to address it. And so they came to Out of Hand and a few other community partners and was like, how can we do this? And we were like, of course, let's create some art and open the conversation. And so those were in-person events. And then when COVID happened, we moved to the online platform, of course. And so now it's a monthly series every third Sunday of the month, where we tackle issues that affect mostly Black and Brown communities. Through COVID, it was the Lift Every Voice series, and it focused on how COVID was affecting those communities. And now we've been able to partner with the FCRC for this series, and we're working with those 36 narratives that Anne was found, and we're creating, or Anne was talking about, excuse me, and we're creating a new piece every month focused on one of the victims or some of the victims, and then we have facilitated conversations afterwards, and it's a really good night of conversation and to learn something you didn't know and see something from a different perspective. And so we have one this Sunday, and it will be the premiere of the play that we will then show in September to 5,000 people in 500 homes across Atlanta. So that's what we're building up to. So it's we're really accessible out there. Our information in the chat, and you can register. Everything is free, and it's really just a good 2 hours of riveting conversation and community.
So I'm just going to put a fine point under that, if you don't mind, Marlon. So
Yeah.
This September, over 4 Sundays, on the 116th anniversary of the 1906 Race Massacre, we are inviting everybody in Atlanta, Fulton County, to become a host, to attend a dinner. Now, to be a host, we'll put it in the chat. We will assign you 10 perfect strangers, a diverse group of strangers who will show up at your house. If you want to be a host, you have to find a place and organize the food. You can make the food if you're a cook. If you're not a cook, you can make the food. You could have it catered. You could do it in a restaurant. You could do it in a park with takeout. You can get your church to do it, your school. So we need 500 hosts because we want to reach 5,000 people. So you get the place and you organize the food. We will send to your dinner an actor who will perform a play, a short play, 5 to 10 minute play that will address the 1906 Race Massacre. We will also, in addition to an actor, we will send a facilitator. And that facilitator will manage a conversation over this dinner of diverse strangers. So you'll meet people you don't know. You'll be able to learn about the Atlanta Race Massacre. You'll be able to have a conversation about that history and really how it relates today. We don't just show up in this moment out of nowhere. It all comes from a history. And so we are really seeking to engage people across this community to learn this history. And so Marlon will put in the chat all kinds of ways that you can get involved in doing this. We're looking for hosts. There's this Sunday, if you come to the Equitable dinner, that's an opportunity. If you come this Sunday to learn about being a host for September and October for those 4 Sundays. And I really encourage, if everyone on this call today became a host, you would put us really near to our goal of being able to have this organized. And so we will appreciate you getting involved. I'm going to also open up the chat right now so people can ask their questions if you have any. I wanted to ask Marlon in particular to talk about the importance of the arts.
Yeah.
In this history. You come to this as an actor, a director, a playwright. What does the arts provide us, and how can people get involved with that aspect of this project?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I love about the arts, theater in particular, since that's the realm I live in, is that it opens up a door to expose ourselves to empathy and to feel something we haven't felt before and take a look into someone else's life. And it's a really good tool to use to teach good communication. You know, acting is all about listening and responding. And so with these projects, it's really about listening to the community and responding and saying, what do we need? How can we tell these stories? How can we reach other people? I also like to personally say, when I create things, I'd rather show you than tell you. And that's what we can do with art. We can always, we can get in a circle and talk around each other for days. And we all know how that sometimes turns out. So sometimes it's like, everyone sit down, look at this art, and then let's talk about it afterwards. So really that's the simple answer for me, is really exposing folks to understanding and empathy.
Yeah, so please put questions in the chat for any of our panelists. I'm going to knock out some of the questions that are in the chat. Someone wanted to know what was said about Georgia State University. GSU Graduate School of Social Work had the original founders of the Fulton County Remembrance Coalition. We have Carol Lamont on our staff, a woman named Allison Van Timba. came together as a group and founded the Fulton County Remembrance Coalition at the School of Social Work at GSU. So that was the reference to GSU. And then we have a question. So in addition to the markers, this is to Anne, are you creating materials for teachers or parents to educate people about 1906? I can talk about what the center is doing, but go ahead and Anne, talk about what the FCRC is doing.
Yes, sure. So we do have narratives and we do have information for teachers and parents to use in constructing lesson plans and taking and moving forward and moving the narrative forward. We encourage it all the time. We do have the quilts that are currently making their way around to different museums that are also another way for teachers and parents to explore the narratives of not just the 1906 race massacre victims, but also all 36 victims of racial terror. And so that, and we have our our community conversations that we're about to start back up, that we invite community to again, engage and talk about the racial terror, the lynchings that happened here in America, and then to provide space for healing and understanding, and in understanding how to use these narratives to teach our children and to teach our community. So yes, we do have material. We also have material from EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, that also supply at our events for people to continue the conversation. And again, we also tell people all the time, please make the 2-hour, 3-hour ride, depending on where you're from, because that will definitely start to open the door to these conversations and these hard truths that we all should be sharing as a collective.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so for those who aren't in Atlanta on this call, welcome. The National Center for Civil and Human Rights is a civil rights museum, civil and human rights museum here in Atlanta, and we're doing curricular materials for about 1906 and the larger practice of racial terror lynching. So not just 1906, as well as curricular materials on convict leasing. We're expanding our building over the next 2 years. We're adding 2 new wings, and one of our new galleries will focus on reconstruction, post-reconstruction, including racial terror and how it was used, both lynching and convict leasing. So I wanted to, we have 15 minutes left. Hank, as I wait for questions to come in, can you tell us anything in particular you've learned in this research into the lives of victims and survivors and their descendants?
Well, sure. Some of the victims and some who survived, but I would certainly think of them as victims as well, were people who had been elevated to some positions of prestige. I think of, there's a man named Luther J. Price. He's not one of the deceased. He didn't die in 1906 in the Race Massacre. There's an elementary school in Atlanta, an APS school named after him. He was the postmaster, a Black postmaster, which I'd have to go back and refresh my memory as to whether he'd been a holdover from Reconstruction. I'm not sure. We characterized him in a play that one of my students wrote, and that the instructor who came in to teach my students how to write dialogue and monologue, Garrett Turner, an Emory graduate, star of stage and screen, he hired, or not hired, he brought in volunteers from New York and Los Angeles and Atlanta, actors, to perform these monologues and dialogues. And one of them was about Luther Price. It's just very affecting. His wife is saying, you don't need to be doing the work, not with all that going on out there. He says, people are waiting for their mail. And that's just a very powerful, humanizing experience to see that. It goes to that issue of resiliency, I think that the kinds of things that we learned about, a man who survived slavery and then survives fighting in the Civil War, and then dies in the Atlanta Race Massacre. George Union Wilder, who's buried at Southview Cemetery. There's a lot of these great stories. I mean, a lot of them were young people, a 13-year-old kid who was killed. That's been one of the other difficulties of finding the family's descendants. Some of these were single, didn't have children, and or very young. And so that's added a level of complication, but we'll persist and keep going and we'll find it. So.
And so just so folks know, this Truth and Transformation project is, it's got partners and strong affiliations, loose affiliations. There's a group of folks called the Coalition to Remember the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre. They also organize a series of events every September around the anniversary. There was a huge effort around the centennial. And last year, there was a week of programming. And so the Southern Truth and Reconciliation Project, STAR, Culture Centers International is another organization that works on this. Their leader was supposed to be here today, but at the last minute couldn't join us. So there are a whole bunch of activities. The center is a place where we link out to these folks, and you can sign up on our website, on our Truth and Transformation page, if you want to be sure to get more information. Kara on our team is going to put in the chat the dates of the Equitable dinners. So I'm going to answer another question from the chat, or open it up to the group. How do we teach the importance of history in Georgia's past in the face of so much political noise about CRT, about critical race theory? So I don't know if someone wants to jump in on that.
I would question, being a parent in APS, and I can distinctly remember the day that my daughter said, came to me about CRCT. And I was very clear with her that while, yes, a lot of people don't want critical race theory, I'm not good with the acronym, critical race theory taught in classrooms around the country, I think it is important, like my mother and my parents and so forth did with us. I think it's important that these discussions are happening in the community, right? Especially in the African-American space. And I told that to my baby. I said to her, like, at the end of the day, I want to be the one to tell you about these so you can understand, one, the voice in which it's being told. I think that when we talk about critical race theory and sharing these narratives, we often forget about who's teaching, right? And we're often forget about, like, there's gonna have to be a lot of training that goes into telling this truth in a way that it is, it can be absorbed and not hurtful to African Americans, because we already deal with enough day-to-day trauma. So to go to school and be taught in a way that is not healing and truth and in transformation is kind of puzzling at times. So where I'm always for community coming together and teaching this history. Again, I come from a household that my representation was always there. I always knew exactly who I was and where I came from, right? So I'm always pushing for community conversations because parents, as the first teachers, the parents understanding how this should be taught, when it should be given in the construct of your home, because you know your baby, right? You know what information they can take in at what time. So I'm always going to say that parents should always, reach out to your neighbor or your community mother or father that has this history and allow the space and the time for the family and the community to get together to share the history, and let that be your foundation of truth, and then go into other spaces that you can add on, but set that foundation in your homes and in your community first.
Yeah. Hank, did you want to?
Well, I just wanted to say something that I guess this is an argument into not presuming anything about people, okay? And not presuming anything about their politics or where their politics leads them. I, as you know, do a podcast called Buried Truths, based on unpunished, racially motivated murders in Georgia history. It's based on the course that I teach at Emory University. And into our second season, I think it was, or maybe it was after the first. And look, I'm not giving you a stenographic view of history and these things. This can be full of emotion because we're talking with people who went through it. We're talking with people who lost their dad, who lost their father's gravesite for 67 years until one of my students found it, you know, and there's a lot of emotion on this. And the education people at WABE had the idea that this ought to be turned into a curriculum for high schoolers and for 8th graders. And they found great interest in it. And they had bids, or I mean, people who proposed that they would like to do it. And in the end, the best proposals came from the state of Georgia Department of Education. Okay. Now, as it's no secret, we have been under very conservative leadership in state government since 2002. And that includes in the State Department of Education. And they were serious about it. They felt this was history people need to know. And they worked and they drafted the whole curriculum, and it was in place down in McDonough at an 8th grade, at a middle school down there. And I'm not sure where it may have expanded since then. I just don't know. But I wouldn't, my first impression was, oh, come on, you think the state of Georgia would want this? I mean, I looked at what the state of Mississippi did when I was a journalist over there, just about textbooks that tried to tell a modicum of truth, you know, and meant getting rid of the textbooks that, you know, wouldn't even mention a Medgar Evers, you know, or James Meredith or something like that, or Fannie Lou Hamer. So I that's why I say, let's be careful about presuming people's motives or, you know, how their politics might influence how it needs to play out in other ways.
Yeah, I want to add to this. You know, one of the center's big missions, probably our most overarching mission, is to help people tap their own power to change the world around them. And there are a lot of people who are really upset about CRT and have been convinced that there's this terrible effort going on to make white children feel bad about themselves. You know, we think that people, when they learn the history of slavery and racial terror lynching, they shouldn't feel bad because they're white. They should feel bad because they're human. You know, it's a very terrible history, and everyone should ponder it and think about it. But you see, there's a lot of misinformation that has people very ginned up about CRT. And the way to oppose it is to go to school board meetings, is to write your representatives. Right now, there is a huge effort of anti-CRT, and not as much, or needs to be as much or more, people saying we want to teach the truth of history. And so there is a way to combat it, which is to, you know, it would take you 10 minutes every day to pick up the phone and call the governor's office. Just write the number down, and on your way to the car in the morning, or on your morning walk, or when you're walking the dog, make a phone call. If everyone did that, we would start to show that there is as much political will for the truth of history. So it is, people think, oh, I could never work on that, I could never change it. It can be addictive once you get started, to call anyone who represents you. Do a little internet research now, write down the numbers of their offices, and every day give them a shout and let your voice be heard. One of the reasons we work with Equitable dinners on these dinners that will happen this fall is so you can meet like-minded people, because there is nothing better to working for social change than to meet other people who feel the way you do. And it is amazing the kinds of things you can come up with to do. The Fulton County Remembrance Coalition is a living example of that, of students who came together, who felt their own power and have done something amazing. So, you know, we're hoping Truth and Transformation can be a project where we begin to show that there is huge political will to tell the truth of history. And we want 1,000, you know, million flowers to bloom, all kinds of organizations doing this work so people can access it in the way that they feel most comfortable. But don't, you know, I see in the chat a lot of people are wringing their hands, but, you know, don't agonize, organize. And there are ways that we can tap our own power, and the center is delighted to try and provide a hub for that, to introduce you here on calls like this to other people. On February 23rd in the evening, our program on convict leasing. Please come to that. That is another episode of Atlanta's history where the truth needs to be told. And the center is organizing a coalition of organizations to build a memorial here in Atlanta about convict leasing, because a lot of people do not know that history at all. And it's another piece of this. You know, I want to say that as we close, there's history that we learn in school, and then there's something called public memory. And public memory is the way we learn about history in our landscape. And I think one of the things that we should remember is that while this history isn't being told, there is still a history being told on the very site where the Atlanta Race Massacre started. There is a statue to Henry Grady. And there are a lot of things in Atlanta named for Henry Grady. And during the Atlanta Race Massacre, 3 of the bodies of victims were laid at the base of Henry Grady's statue. Henry Grady was a big promoter of Atlanta, an editor of a newspaper, and a major white supremacist. Just as one of his speeches that he made from 1888, he said, "The supremacy of the white race of the South must be maintained forever, and domination by the Negro race resisted at all points and at all hazards because the white race is the superior race." And there's a statue to Henry Grady in downtown Atlanta. And so there is a version of history being told, but it's not the whole truth, and it venerates a certain point of view. And so it is very important for the memorial from EJI to come to Atlanta and tell the truth, tell a fuller history, tell the whole story. Because right now, in much of our city, we're only telling a half truth. And Benjamin Franklin once said, "Half a truth is often a great lie," because you don't get the full story. So we hope all of you on this call will join our Truth and Transformation Project, will join the work of the organizations represented on this call. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Hank. Thank you, Marlon. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please tune into our other Black History Month programming.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Great being with you.
Absolutely. Bye.